about 50% of NATO members currently are freeloaders. They're not meeting the 50% threshold that the alliance has given itself. So Canada, in a way, is in good company. But really, what the debate is all about is which metrics actually should count.
Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, and foreign policy. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. Our esteemed guests offer unique insights and analysis that you won't find anywhere else. In this week's episode, Benjamin Zyla, Assistant Professor in the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa, joins us for a recap of last week's Vilnius Summit. We discuss the major outcomes of the summit, break down the communiqué, and discuss Canada's NATO contributions, the 2% defense spending threshold, and the status of Ukraine's NATO membership aspirations. This is the Expert Series. Benjamin, great to have you on the program. Thanks for joining us today. Let's set the scene a little bit. What do you think are the most significant takeaways from both the recent Vilnius Summit and the 2023 communiqué, more generally, but also particularly for Canada?
Yeah, thanks very much, first of all, for the invitation. The offer of NATO membership for Ukraine really has been on the table since 2008. If we may recall, in 2008, there was a NATO summit in Bucharest where the heads of state and governments basically told the Ukraine and Georgia that they could become members. The only problem is they did not say when and how this would happen or could happen. And so both countries kind of stayed in a bit of a gray area where it wasn't really clear what the path for them would be. And this gray zone existence was ultimately also one of the reasons for Russia to attack Ukraine in 2014 and subsequently attacking again in 22, because it was clear that Ukraine, in such a gray zone and not yet being a member of NATO, would be kind of sort of in a way, in a difficult position to completely defend itself. Now, the main task of the NATO summit in Vilnius was really to overcome this gray zone, or this gray area of vagueness, and to make really a concrete commitment towards Ukraine. It was really never about, as some analysts would have suggested before the summit, and I say this very explicitly and very clearly, the idea was never really to ask Ukraine to join NATO tomorrow or the stage of Sweden in like a few months. The idea was really to lay out a path where and when it could become a member of the alliance, and it was. So in that sense, it was quite clear that as long as the war continues, there will be no accession of Ukraine to NATO, because at the end of the day, that would actually mean NATO would be part of the war. So it was really about getting Ukraine out of this gray zone and to tell them something more concrete, and that they will eventually become a member. So if we take that as the sort of background, this historical background, this really actually did happen. That is to say, there was a big political promise by the Allies that Ukraine could join the alliance. And in a way, that concrete promise never really materialized. It was a political pledge that eventually it would become a member of the alliance, but there was no concrete pledge that it would happen sort of tomorrow. Now, having said that, Ukraine did not leave the summit with an empty hands either. There has been some progress on that front. For example, there are now long-term cooperation projects, especially by the G7 countries, as well as on a bilateral basis. Now, what is really new is that there's now a NATO-Ukraine Council, and that is not really unimportant. It's actually quite significant because with that Ukraine Council, the Ukraine now has a permanent institutionalized access to NATO's political leadership and the bureaucracy, and it didn't have that before. And moreover, in parallel to the NATO summit, there was a whole series of bilateral commitments of support, as I've just suggested, in the G7 format. The Germans have put together a new package. The Americans have put together a new support package. Altogether, 11 states have said that they finally want to put sort of a training mechanism in place to train Ukrainian pilots on F-16 fighter jets. And as I said, the G7 and its strongest, which are of course the strongest economic states, have put together a package ranging from arms deliveries to reconstruction and so forth. So there is quite a little bit of support. And so you asked me what are some of the other sort of takeaways from the summit in addition to what I've just said. There's perhaps another important element are plans for emergencies. So NATO has passed new defense plans, and the heads of states of government have approved them. Of course, they have been prepared in the background prior to the summit. And really the idea was how would NATO react to a future scenario, something like a Russian attack on Eastern Europe or Eastern member states of the NATO alliance. Like I said, those documents are very secret, and they were, of course, prepared by the militaries, by the SACEUR, and we are told they're about 4,000 pages long. They describe really in detail how critical places in alliance territory should be protected by deterrence and defended in an emergency, such as the Russian attack on alliance territory. So really what we're talking here about is nitty-gritty details down to sort of the last soldier in terms of logistics, in terms of political communication, etc. And for this purpose, it is also defined which military capabilities are necessary and required by each member state. And of course, that is very, very secret. So in addition to land, air, and naval forces, cyber and space capabilities are also included in that plan that NATO as a whole now adopted, and it's in place. The other point that was raised was and I'm sure we're going to come back to this in a few minutes, is the 2% target. So the 2% target is a political benchmark where allies pledge to eventually spend up to 2% of their GDP on defense. The new language is that NATO now considers the 2% benchmark as the minimum benchmark. So there's a slight shift in language. The third or fourth point to take away from the summit is there is a new hope for Sweden. As we all know, the Turkish president agreed to ratify the application that Sweden put forward. So it seems to be a very clear path for Sweden towards joining the alliance. And of course, China, to make a sort of big run through another hot topic, China has now been listed as a country that is challenging NATO values. And therefore, NATO and its allies should be prepared for this. This China clause, if you want to put it in those terms, was specifically addressed upon request by the Americans. And last but not least, and I will stop there, is the NATO Center of Excellence in Montreal. It hasn't really attracted much media attention, but the NATO heads of states and government signed a founding document for a new NATO Climate Change and Security Center of Excellence to be hosted in Montreal. This initiative is led by Canada and has been in the preparation for a very long time. Canada will act as the framework nation, and the center, like I said, will be located in Montreal. Canada will spend about $40 million over 5 years to setting up the center and getting it running. And what's its purpose? Its purpose is really to enable NATO allies to understand and address sort of the serious security implications of climate change. So it kind of brings together climate change issues with security issues, including the Arctic, and it will support the NATO Climate Change and Security Action Plan. And finally, and I'm sure we're going to come back to this as well, the Canadian Prime Minister has pledged additional about $542 million for Ukraine. And I mean, this is not nothing. This is not sort of just pocket change. It's quite a bit of money, and it comes in addition to already 8 billion spent in sort of multifaceted assistance that Canada has provided to Ukraine since the beginning of 2022, when the war started.
Canadians, I think, have historically, traditionally like to think of ourselves as peacekeepers, a smaller nation that punches above its weight in international affairs. But sure, you know as much as the next person that lately terms like freeloader and freerider have been increasingly applied to Canada in relation to our NATO contributions. So we've been frequently derided lately for our NATO contributions and for failing to meet the 2% threshold. So I ask you, are us Canadians really freeloaders or freeriders?
I'm really passionate about this question, which has actually been part of my research for almost 20 years now. And I have answered the question in my book, in my first book called Sharing the Burden, NATO and its middle powers, where I examined amongst sort of Canada, other middle powers contributions to NATO up until Afghanistan. So this is where sort of the analytical time frame stopped. But to give you a short answer, I would argue that we're not freeloaders in NATO. And so let me dive a little bit deeper into that debate, which has polarized NATO actually since 1949 and has been hotly debated ever since. And there's a reason for that, because the Washington Treaty, which establishes NATO, does not actually outline how the alliance should be funded. It's a political commitment and it's a negotiation that takes place on a yearly basis, basically. But there's no sort of provision in the Washington Treaty that that kind of outlines which countries should be paying for what and how much. So the first interesting question is, to me as a researcher, and perhaps it's more of a political question, but it's so the first interesting question, if that's the case, if there's no section in the Washington Treaty, why has nobody pushed to change that in its 75-year history? So if it's so contested, why has nobody dared to put a motion forward to change the Washington Treaty? But that's perhaps just as a side note, as a researcher. Really, in terms of the substance, what this debate about the 2% and whether Canada and other countries are freeloaders, actually, just as a footnote to that, about 50% of NATO members currently are freeloaders. They're not meeting the 50% threshold that the alliance has given itself. So Canada, in a way, is in good company. But really, what the debate is all about is which metrics actually should count. And so the literature establishes really two schools. And I'm, like I said, I've spent about 20 years looking at this in my research program, and I've sort of added onto the analysis, and I will come back to that in a second. So the first one is the input side, what I would call the input side of NATO burden sharing. And that is essentially how much each member state invests into their defense as a share of their GDP. So this is, to put it simple, essentially your 2% benchmark debate, and that has been going on for years now. It's not only just come up recently, it's been going on for years. Actually, it goes back to, like I said, the birth of NATO in 1949, even though back then we didn't talk about the 2% mark. The second school is actually looking at a different metric, and that is what I would call the output school. That is the commitment to NATO operations. So Germany, Canada, and a number of other countries, especially Eastern European countries, tend to be in this camp. And they would argue that it doesn't really matter how much you put into the alliance, it really matters what comes out of the alliance. So in other words, they're saying that you can invest less than other countries into NATO and yet achieve the same goal. So in other words, or achieve a higher output. So really what they're looking at is deployments of soldiers on NATO operations. And if you want, I can dive a little bit deeper into this. Now, if you take the input and the output school as a starting point, I have argued in my most recent research is to actually look at the impact that member states' investments actually make inside NATO. Now, this measure not only includes an analysis of the outcomes of a particular operations on member states' contributions thereto, but also its sustainability. For example, in a peacekeeping mission to ensure a lasting peace. So in other words, if you deploy in a peacekeeping mission, let's say in Bosnia, you can measure the impact of peace over a long time, of a, let's say 10, 15 years time period. And so in the literature, we call this the impact, the long-lasting impact, the sustainability of somebody's efforts. So more specifically, if I want to put it in more sort of academic terms, NATO inputs and resources are used to carry out certain activities. Inputs and activities encompass, for example, the financial and human resources that are used to implement a specific, NATO activity, whether it's an operation or, anything that sort of NATO heads of state and government kind of decide on. Allied activities then lead to collective services, which are usually a direct outcome of the NATO activity or products delivered. So in other words, what we're talking here about is outputs. But then over time, outputs then contribute to a form of change, to a certain form of change. So we would call them perhaps outcome. And this is more of an assessment of a sort of a longer term effect that NATO activities actually have. So whether it's, for example, crisis management interventions or implementing peace agreements, and their sort of, effect on a particular conflict or a particular country over time. For example, one might measure, one might want to measure the demonstrable outcomes of NATO peace builders in Bosnia, as I've just said, whether they achieved a certain objective or a certain mandate that they were giving. So in other words, we can speak of this final outcome as the impact. That is when outcomes really represent the raison d'etre of an alliance policy or an alliance program or an alliance initiative, and contribute to kind of higher NATO strategic outcomes over a long period of time. And that, in a nutshell, really is when we look at impacts, we're looking at long-term impacts, sustainable impacts, and we're moving beyond simple quantitative measures of alliance burden sharing, which is what the input and the output side really have been doing. But rather, sort of the impact assessments open the doors for a qualitative assessment of member states' contributions to the alliance. And last but not least, sort of in the same along the same lines, in my most recent article, I've argued that what we really need to look at is the practice of NATO burden sharing. In other words, NATO as an institution has a certain process in place by which it determines how much member states should pay into sort of the NATO pot. But there's a long-term practice by each member state that kind of explains why states either to some people underperform or overperform, whether they're freeloaders or high achievers. So there's a holistic picture behind it to study the practice of burden sharing, so to speak, is what opens up an analytical perspective of merging things like your GDP, strategic culture, your historical experiences, whether it's domestic politics. So it opens a whole range of additional qualitative variables to push the NATO burden sharing research program, which I have argued is very static, it's very rationalist, it's very sort of input output driven, but it doesn't allow a deeper understanding, a deeper causal understanding of why states behave in a certain way, or to put it more colloquially, why they share a certain burden and not others. So we're missing that. We're missing that understanding. We're missing that explanation in the literature. Now, since you've asked me about Canada, when we look at just at the output side of NATO burden sharing, which is what I've argued in the past, and I've updated the numbers ever since my first book, Sharing the Burden ? Came out. If we really look at the numbers, we cannot really say that Canada was a freeloader in NATO operations since the end of the Cold War. If we just quickly walk through those operations, so it starts with the I-4, or the implementation force, in the early 1990s. The implementation force, or I-4, was set up in December 1995, and it lasted 1 year to December 1996. So out of the 16 member states, NATO member states, that contributed to that operation, Canada shared about 2% of the entire force share, which is around rank 9 out of 16 allies. So it's not really a freeloading. It's kind of like its middle power status. It's kind of, moving along. It's contributing to an operation. It's not a high achiever, but it's not a freeloader either. And of course, the implementation force, if we sort of fast forward to 1996, the so-called stabilization force, or the 30,000 strong force that was implemented by NATO, was kind of the successor to I-4. Well, Canada shared actually 5.5% of the total force share out of 205,000 troops. That is not nothing, and it actually ranked 8th out of 29 or whatever it is member states. I mean, for K4, it actually ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 out of 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, out of 19 member states. So again, it's kind of in the middle. It ranks in the middle, but it's by no means a freeloader. It's by no means, riding on somebody else's back. It is contributing what it can. I mean, above all, we are a middle power. We have very limited resources in terms of human resources, but also in terms of financial resources. And so I would say at the end of the day, this was a long answer to your question, but we're not freeloaders in the NATO alliance. It really depends on what metric you're using and what you're really trying to measure. And even if you're measuring the outputs, I would still say this is a very incomplete picture that you're drawing, because what are some of the things? There are about 4 or 5 things that you can take away from those numbers. The first thing is, I would say, Canada is not a freeloader, but also Europe is not a freeloader. You will see this as a very sort of American-centric, a very American-dominated sort of rhetoric or narrative, but it really requires serious qualifications. In I-4, S-4, and K-4, the European contributions were over time actually more substantial than the Americans when we just look at the force contributions. The exception is NATO's mission to Afghanistan, which, by the way, just to complete the picture, Canada actually ranked 5th between 2003 and 2014 in ISAF in terms of its force contributions. More than 21,500 troops were deployed there over time, and again, this is not nothing. The second point is simply focusing, as I've just said, simply focusing on the input of defense spending gives rise to a picture of American largesse. Yet when looking at the outputs of the spending, as I've just said, the provision of forces to operation, the picture actually looks much different for Canada, but also the Europeans. And that inversion reflects one of the many problems of the GDP measure. Obviously, the US spends significantly more on defense, both in absolute terms, but also in relative terms, than its NATO allies. But, and I would suggest most importantly, That sum reflects its global security responsibilities and not just those in Europe. That is a big difference. The Americans are thinking globally, and most, if not all, the European members are thinking of NATO are thinking in European terms. So at the end of the day, most of the American defense budget at any given time is spent on non-NATO related contingencies. It is simply misleading. In other words, I suggest that the total defense budget of the US is an accurate comparator of how the US stands along its NATO allies. It's just not just to use the American defense budget to compare to other NATO allies' defense budget. The third point I would suggest is that, and let me be very clear about this, none of this is to say that, or none of this is to belittle the American contributions to European security. And it remains the case that the allies, of course, heavily depend on the US for their collective defense. And that is also evident, or became evident again at the Vilnius summit last week. But these dependencies are not fatal to allies, to Allied resolve. Looking at the specific details of NATO conflict management missions or management operations is a good output indicator of, as I've just walked you through those numbers, of how in practice European allies and Canada actually have stepped up when the call from NATO and its allies and certain allies came in. And last but not least, the fourth point, as a takeaway from those numbers, the data, I suggest, while casting an important light on operational matters, still only tell part of the story. The patterns of deployment reflect the fact that the European allies and Canada were able to prioritize effects when the circumstances dictated it, and efforts towards operational deployment reflected really a combination of urgent national interest, which is more evident in the Balkan wars and Afghanistan, and American pressure, which is more evident in Afghanistan than in the Balkans. So really, in sum, I would suggest we really need to take a balanced look at the 2% benchmark, and to really be clear of what we mean by somebody is freeloading on the alliance or other allies, than just saying, Canada is a free rider.
I had several more questions planned for you, but I think we've covered a lot of ground in the past half hour or so. So I'll leave you with one before I turn back to you again for some final thoughts. What specific steps can Canada and the allies take to support Ukraine's path towards NATO membership while managing the risks of escalating tensions with Russia? And I'm wondering maybe if you could touch upon, once again, the extent to which Ukraine's NATO membership bid moved forward in any way at the Vilnius summit.
To me, it seems to be that the message for Ukraine is that they will eventually become member of NATO once the war is over. I think that was a clear message that was passed on in the Vilnius summit. And I think this is in our own national security interests and the security and stability interests of Western Europe, and of course in Europe as well. That is to ensure that the war is over as soon as possible, and then Russia is actually not successful with grabbing foreign territory under the umbrella of its nuclear weapons. Because, and I think this is an important point, because if Ukraine were to lose this war and be partially or wholly occupied by Russia, the security situation for us Western states would be extremely worse. In the same way, if the reconstruction, which is already underway, fails, or the democratic reform processes that are currently underway kind of fail, it will also become more unstable in our country and us as being part of this alliance. What else? I'm wondering. Some people have argued this. Some analysts and commentators have put this idea forward. What really would be the alternative other than offering Ukraine membership in NATO? If Ukraine were to win the war and would not be part of NATO, it would be militarily strong, but the political leaders would be relatively inexperienced. I mean, remember Zelensky and his ministers, they're not sort of, they're not a political elite with decades of political experience or leadership. And so what is important, I think, in the long term is to bring Ukraine into the alliance, because membership in an alliance, in a way, also has a certain control function of alliance, of other allies, but also of political elites. And so I think this is an important point to stress, that an alliance always has an internal effect where other allies have not only access to other member states, but they also control and there's a certain direction that is going on. But having said that, what it would actually mean today is that Western states must do everything that they can to support Ukraine militarily and financially to actually achieve this goal. Because only if, as we've discussed, only if Ukraine actually wins the war, it can join the NATO alliance. And to be honest, I think we have to lay down our own cards, because for how long the Ukraine can continue to fight against Russia in its own territory really depends on us Western states. Now, for example, if we look at how the Ukrainians are fighting against the Russian fortifications, it does so, we need to remind ourselves, it does so without air support. Ukraine essentially doesn't have an air force at the moment, or very little thereof. In other words, the Canada and the United States and basically all NATO allies would never let their soldiers fight without air support. This is way too dangerous, but the Ukraine is currently doing this. So in other words, how the Ukrainians can continue to liberate their territory depends really on how much equipment they have from us. This is the supply of ammunition, this is the supply of spare parts, this is replacing destroyed equipment, and this is also the question of financial support. So they can pay, for example, the wages of the soldiers, the wages of their governmental employees, to pay for social services and so forth. So this is a long-term political support for Ukraine. And against this backdrop, I would suggest the announcement of the ministers of defense of Belgium, Canada, Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Sweden, and the United Kingdom to training Ukrainian Air Force pilots in operating and maintaining F-16 fighter aircraft, in my personal view, is actually the right one. The announcement explicitly includes the provision also to train Ukrainian soldiers on other fighter jets if this becomes necessary. So there's a clear signal to Russia that we're not only able and willing to train Ukrainian soldiers on how to run these F-16 fighter jets, but also, if necessary, we can do more, and we're willing and able to do more. But it's not only training pilots. That training also includes making trainers available on our side, but also training support staff, that maintenance workers, those people who kind of fuel those aircraft. So essentially providing all the logistics around running aircrafts, maintenance, equipment, etc. Moreover, I think the G7 pledge that was made to Ukraine on the margins of the NATO summit in Vilnius is not trivial either. It's not trivial. At least in my estimation. Essentially what the G7 are saying is that they are committed to a free, independent, democratic, and sovereign Ukraine that is essentially capable of defending itself and deterring future aggression, and through long-term bilateral security commitments to ensure Ukraine's security. I mean, this is not nothing. This is actually, it's perhaps the second best scenario, the second best outcome for Ukraine out of for this summit, that there is a strong commitment on paper that the G7 would actually, worst comes to worst, defend Ukraine for a long period of time. So in other words, it would ensure its security. Now, this, of course, is not the NATO membership that Ukraine was hoping for, but it is a security guarantee nonetheless. And so that is the important takeaway. In terms of, you asked me what is Canada's role in all this? I think we, as Canada, we have a very limited stockpile of weapons and ammunitions to give away, as many other NATO members as well, without kind of running low on our own stocks and without running the risk of not being able to actually have these capabilities ourselves. But what often gets forgotten in this discussion on sort of supporting Ukraine militarily is there's also civilian side to what we can and perhaps should do to support the Ukraine. This includes, for example, the financial support for the Comprehensive Assistance Package, or the CAP, for the Ukraine, and that includes monies for fuel, bridging equipment, rations, cyber assistance, and a whole range of other things. And perhaps last but not least, and I think this is where Canada could play a political role, and perhaps even should play a political role. Some analysts have suggested over the past few days a so-called Israel model for Ukraine that essentially provides security guarantees until it formally joins the alliance. To me, this kind of Israel model is comprised of three pillars, two of which I think could be areas where Canada could make an investment. The first one is very heavily equipped and super modern trained armed forces for Ukraine. So think of your highly trained soldiers, but also the best equipment that Ukraine could be getting. The second is equally important, is a whole network of bilateral commitments, not only made by Canada, but other NATO allies as well. So there's very close cooperation. If we go back to the Israel model, there's a very close cooperation between the United States and Israel, and also between the other countries when it comes to sort of financing, arms cooperation, research and development, and so forth. And there's a third component, and this is the most problematic one. And I think this is where Canada ultimately not only has a national interest, but also political interest to guide not only the discussion, but also to find a solution potentially in the future. And that is the talk about nuclear weapons. So really what the so-called Israel model is all about, it's about modern and trained forces. It's about a network of bilateral commitments in terms of cooperation in the military realm, and it's a nuclear shield. And basically these three pillars are what makes or guarantees Israel's security at the moment. Now, let me so perhaps in the last minute or two that I have, the problem I think with this Israel model is that it really does imply a concrete nuclear component. To put it in plain sort of non-technical language, this means that either the United States protects Ukraine with its own nuclear weapons, or, and this is the worst part, or the worst alternative, Ukraine is developing nuclear weapons itself, which in my opinion actually would neither be desirable nor should be. It is actually enormous step backwards. And let me just explain this. Ukraine has surrendered its nuclear weapons that it inherited from the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the Cold War. So it had given it away, and in return, it had received security assurances, including from Russia. And those security assurances were actually written on paper. Also, Russia signed it, and a number of other countries, for example, the United States, signed it. And so that kind of agreement guaranteed that the Ukraine would not develop nuclear weapons. And if that would come true, or if it would not come true, then Ukraine would actually develop its own nuclear weapons, which it is capable of doing. So in other words, either we supply Ukraine with nuclear weapons, or we this kind of Israel model would require Ukraine to develop its own nuclear weapons, and therefore it would be stepped back in terms of nuclear arms proliferation. And so I think there is, I think that's really the problem with the Israel model that I would have in terms of nuclear proliferation for the Ukraine, whether it was supplied by the West or Western states, or whether Ukraine would do it itself, I think is highly problematic. It's also highly problematic politically, because we're essentially trying, internationally speaking, we're trying to find agreements by reducing nuclear arms proliferation rather than increasing it. And so I think at the end of the day, what Ukraine needs at the moment is a strong military commitment, is a strong military supply that essentially would provide a clear pathway for Ukraine to join the alliance, and to actually move away from problems about nuclear armament or rearmament. And for Canada, I think the role should be and must be to work international partners and councils to make sure that we're not switching towards a nuclear rearmament and a nuclear proliferation in Europe, but rather the opposite. That is, I think, where Canada as a middle power can play a huge role, and to negotiate concrete international agreements and treaties to that end.
Benjamin, I hope to have you on the program in the future. This has been great.
My pleasure. Anytime.
That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.